What is something you opted out of that went horribly wrong for those that went through with it? The Cave Creek disaster: 14 people died when a viewing platform collapsed. It took 2 hours for the first responders to get there, which was no fault of theirs. It was simply rough terrain and isolated. 2 of my mates died there, and I was meant to go, but was hungover as hell. I worked with the engineer who designed the platform about 3 years later, and the poor guy still believed it was his fault. Which it wasn't. He designed it perfectly. The workers who constructed it used the wrong size bolts. Holy shit. I feel so damn bad for that guy. As an engineer, that's the scariest thing about what I do for a living. That I'll make the smallest of mistakes, and then find out years later that people died because of this one little thing I did wrong. It has literally kept me awake at night before, just going over things in my head, wondering if I didn't forget this or that. I live in Aurora, Colorado, and I was planning on going to the showing of The Dark Knight. James Holmes went on a mass shooting rampage during a movie screening. 12 people were killed and 70 others were injured, 58 of them from gunfire. Not that I opted out, but my car battery died that night, and I couldn't drive there. I thank my lucky stars that I was not involved, and I'm terrified that I could have possibly died. I left my friend's 18th birthday party where everyone was already smashed, at approximate 7 p.m., came back around 10 and pulled into the alley right in front of the police. Everyone went to jail but me and a very intoxicated friend who was passed out behind a shed, and the police didn't see him. On a road trip, everyone stopped at a Sonic and got burgers. I didn't get anything because I didn't want to be too gassy in the car. Everyone got terrible food poisoning, except me. Not me, but back in the early 80s my dad was diagnosed with leukemia. I don't have all details correct, but the gist of it is, him along with several other people with the same affliction were given the choice to undergo the traditional method of treatment involving bone marrow transplants and whatnot, or go through with some kind of newer, experimental version of chemotherapy. Out of the group of around 10 people, him and a Catholic priest chose chemo, while the others chose the bone marrow transplants. My father and the priest were the only ones to survive. Company I worked for, large multinational, relocated the division headquarters from where they had moved me 5 years before to a shithole city. They called it a lateral move, so there would be no pay increase. I took the severance package, and negotiated 6 additional months of work to train my replacements. During the 6 months I also got to attend a major user conference on the company expense bonus. With 2 months left in my tenure, they announced they were dissolving the division and selling off the resources. Most of my coworkers were left unemployed in a new city with no connections or prospects. I, on the other hand, stopped working on my designated day, a Friday, and started working my next job, for more money, the next Monday, with a nice fat severance check arriving 4 weeks later. When I was a kid my family was supposed to take a bus trip to visit my aunt. My dad had a bad feeling the morning we were supposed to leave, so we canceled the trip. The bus was on a bridge that got hit by a ship and it went off into the water. I don't remember how many people died, but thank goodness my dad listened to his instinct. Not me, but my parents. They had planned a trip to Virginia Beach with a close friend of theirs. They were to take a small plane down, spend a few days, then fly back. My uncle DJ'd for a local radio station at the time and was given a few tickets to see The Who. He offered his spares to my mom and dad, who accepted even though it was the same weekend as the planned beach trip. Their friend ended up going, but the flight back never made it. The pilot was advised not to depart, as there was severe weather along his flight path, but he went for it anyways. The plane crashed with no survivors. If it weren't for them deciding to go see The Who, I wouldn't be here. I'm named after the friend that died, and was coincidentally born a year after the day they found out. Who told the pilot not to fly? Was it ATC? If so, why the fuck would they let him go anyways? A flight service station. They tell people about weather, traffic, and a host of other things depending on the station, but they cannot issue commands or grant clearances. A group of my friends were smoking synthetic marijuana at a party in the days where it was a new thing and hadn't made the news for the adverse effects it causes. I turned it down because I had college the next day and had to go home and rest up. I heard the next day that 2 of my buddies had ended up in hospital having suffered seizures, and the third had suffered temporary heart problems. I was doing one of those really famous obstacle course mud races. Got to an obstacle that involved jumping off a 15-foot platform into muddy water. I climbed to the top, took one look down, and freaked out. There was no way to tell how deep the water was because it was so muddy, and here were people smiling and doing flips off the platform into the water. I had tears running down my face from the panic, so I climbed down and ran around it. A few hours after my heat, a guy died on that obstacle due to accidental drowning. He went down and didn't come back up and just simply went unnoticed in the excitement and energy of the crowd, which was my fear to begin with. My roommate and another very good friend competed in that race as well. They had similar feelings to yours, and were worried about their clothes and shoes weighing them down in the water, so also decided to skip the obstacle. I'm really thankful that they, and you, made that choice. Thankfully this wasn't me, but my friend was involved in it. A family was out making their first tandem skydive together at my home drop zone. The girl, I'll call her Lucky, had just turned 18 and she wanted to do a skydive but didn't want to go first once she arrived at the drop zone. In addition to Lucky, her grandmother, the 75-year-old Claudette, wanted to skydive to check it off her bucket list. I skydived out of this small drop zone north of Las Vegas. It had one Cessna 182 and one tandem instructor at times. Because of this, only one person could go on a tandem jump that day. Lucky was too scared to go at first, so Claudette opted to go in her granddaughter's place to show her that everything would be alright. Everything went fine on the free fall portion of the skydive, but when the parachute opened there was some sort of malfunction. The main canopy got tangled up somehow with the reserve and sent Claudette and her tandem skydiving instructor, my friend James Fonsbeck, plummeting towards Earth at a high rate of speed. James was unable to get the parachute opened and they impacted the ground. James, the hero that he was, put his back towards the ground to receive the full impact of the blow. He was trying to save Claudette. Sadly, she would pass away shortly thereafter. As sad as this is, I always think that fate, luck, or whatever you want to call it, put Claudette in the plane that day to save the life of Lucky. Last year was my first year as a Northeastern student. The Boston Marathon was going on about a mile away, and my friend messaged me asking if I was still planning on going to see the finish line with them because it was Patriots' Day and we had no class. Fortunately, I was lazy and decided I'd rather take a nap than follow through on my plans with friends. Turns out my friends ended up not going when I decided not to meet up with them. I woke up to the sound of dozens of emergency vehicle sirens driving past. I later learned that there had been an act of terror at the finish line of the Boston Marathon. 2 explosions occurred 12 seconds apart, killing 3 people and injuring more than 280. A couple of friends from college wanted to go camping one weekend. It sounded fun, so I asked my folks if I could borrow a tent and some supplies, as we were big campers when I was young and my friend didn't have a tent. It gets closer to the time, and the situation changes to a hike before camping and doing it late in the evening after work to a campground that none of us had ever been to. I knew that the forest gets dark at least an hour earlier than open sky, because of all the trees. I ended up deciding not to go as it just didn't sound like a good idea to me. Come to find out later, they went anyways, and my friend's dog, who has a problem stomach, got sick and had diarrhea in the tent that night. That would have been my tent. Totally expected some ghost story shit to go down in this one, but nope, a crapping dog. Even better! In Boy Scouts, I was supposed to be the acting senior patrol leader for the week-long summer camp. I was going for my Eagle at the time, and this trip was meant to prove my leadership skills beyond my project. I got pneumonia a couple weeks before the trip and had to pull out. On that trip, there were 2 very serious incidents that I would not have been able to prevent that would have been blamed on me. First, one of the scouts threw an aerosol can into the fire. No one there was brave enough to fish it out with a stick, so they all ran and hid. It turns out that the scoutmaster was driving into camp about that time. He pulled up to the campsite, stepped out of his jeep, and as he walked over to the fire, the can exploded. A few days after that, a couple scouts, both older than me, decided to use a spare tent to practice knife throwing. They completely ruined a big canvas tent. It's the only time that coughing so hard that it makes me vomit has ever felt like dodging a bullet. Not me, but my dad. He grew up in a rougher area of town. Basically, his childhood reads like an S.E. Hinton book. Well, him and his best friend are at a party, and my dad decides to leave to hang out with this girl. Never sees his best friend again. All winter his friend is missing and assumed a runaway until spring comes and they find his body in a stack of tires in a storage yard. Apparently my dad and his friend had pissed these two dudes off. Coincidentally, the two suspects die within a year of the body being discovered. One by a house fire, and the other carbon monoxide poisoning. Karma is a bitch. I know the Reddit happy ending is what you all were hoping for, but the reality of it is that these two a-holes probably died at their own hands. Do you have a similar story? Leave a comment, and subscribe to the channel if you want to see more videos like this one.